Good afternoon, everyone. Today we have an exciting presentation representing a new initiative within the Value Institute, a project that represents a collaboration between the legal community and the healthcare community, known as the Delaware Medical Legal Partnership. This program was actually supported by a gift to the Value Institute at Harrington, we call it the Harrington Trust, or the Harrington Community Partnership, where we identify promising projects that help address the social determinants of health. And when we came across this one, it really piqued our interest because it was an unusual, from our perspective, a unique connection between legal services and patient health outcomes. And so today, both Susan Smolla and Marissa Band are going to talk to us about this very exciting initiative. Before I turn it over to them, there are a few mandatory remarks I must make. For CME credits, you must now text the CME office to receive credit. This is for both online and in-person viewers. There are handouts by the sign-in sheet. Make sure you sign in, and please RSVP so we can better prepare for the next session. The next presentation scheduled for this series is on Global Surgery 2030 by John Mira from the Harvard School of Medicine, and he will be here August 19th. And he's part of the G4 Alliance, which is obstetrics, trauma, anesthesia, and surgical care for patients' global health. See the full schedule of all of our presentations on the ACCEL website. That's ACCEL website. And also previous presentations are available on our website, delaware-ctr.org. I'd like to welcome our guests to the podium. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jackson. My name is Susan Smolla, and I'm a research investigator at the Value Institute. And Marissa Band is a supervising attorney for the Community Related Society Incorporated, and she is one of the attorneys who is working on the medical legal partnership here. Her involvement is actually high level, as well as actually dealing with some of the clients as well. She's been instrumental in implementing this project at the hospitals. So our objectives for this talk today are to first describe the need and purpose of the medical legal partnership, and then explain how that process was actually implemented here in Delaware at Christiana Care. And finally, we have a couple of really quick process measures of what we've seen to date on this implementation here at the hospital. So I'm going to start and let Marissa start and tell you a little bit about why medical legal partnerships are really important now.
Thank you. So I just want to start with an example. You're working at the hospital, and a 24-year-old female who's 21 weeks pregnant comes in. She's been coughing and wheezing. Both of her children have similar symptoms. She has runny nose. Otherwise, she's got no fevers, no throat pain, no change of appetite, vomiting, etc. She does have a remote history of asthma, but she hasn't had symptoms in years. So there's nothing really clearly explaining why this is happening. But then she mentions that the symptoms started about 2 months ago when the family moved into a new apartment where there's mold in the basement, the refrigerator does not work well, their food is constantly spoiling, the electrical sockets fall out of the walls, the front doors will not lock securely. You're very concerned about this patient for her own safety and health as well as for her children. You consult social work. Social worker provides a list of temporary shelters and directs the family to apply for government housing. The patient says, well, thank you, but this isn't really going to fix the problem. There are years waiting lists for the public housing, and I don't want to live in a shelter. I just want to stay at home. And I can't afford to get out of a new lease. So you're kind of stuck. What do you do? evolved Greater Boston Legal Services, and eventually the formal medical legal partnership movement was born. Today, over 294 healthcare institutions are involved in medical legal partnerships across the country, about 126 legal aid agencies, and it's in around 36 states. So what is the purpose of MLPs, or medical legal partnerships? One of the big purposes is to address what we call the healthcare spending paradox that we have in this country. It's estimated that 90% of what affects our health happens outside of the four walls of the doctor's office, and that only 10% of what affects our health is what happens within clinical care. But in the U.S., 97% of our spending for health care is on clinical care. That means we're only spending 3% on the 90% of what affects our health. So just looking at what these social determinants of health are that are affecting our health outside of the clinical health care, we have social circumstances, so individuals that have income and housing insecurities. MLPs can address those types of issues by appealing a denial for Social Security disability and getting a patient with long-term stable income. Environmental exposure, going back to the example I gave you with the mold and the substandard housing conditions, an MLP can address that by suing the landlord to remedy the problem. Behavior patterns, MLPs can even address that. Maybe you have a patient with a traumatic brain injury who's not in a very good place in his life. He's not working. He's perhaps getting involved in the criminal justice system because of court impulse control and impaired executive functioning. An MLP could potentially help get him into a Medicaid waiver program to give him access to TBI-specific aid programs to help him learn how to regulate some of his behaviors to get access to supported employment so he can be a productive citizen moving forward. So another reason that we need MLPs is because there's what we call, there's a gap in access to legal services. As of 2014, 14.8% of Americans were living in poverty, including 21.1% of children. Data shows that low-income households experience on average 1 to 3 unmet civil legal needs in a year. Fewer than 1 in 5 people living in poverty are able to receive help with civil legal needs. And the reason for that is that there's a huge disparity between access to attorneys. So for the general population, there's a private lawyer for every 429 people, but for someone who's living in poverty, there's only one legal aid lawyer for every 6,415 people. And if you think back to the statistics I gave you between 1 and 3 unmet legal needs, that's a lot of need that goes unmet. And it turns things back over to Susan for some of the data.
So Marissa just gave us kind of an overview of some of the more the national reasons why we have legal needs for how patients can have legal needs. In the spring of last year, Christiana Care did a survey of patients to determine what kind of legal needs may be rampant in our hospital that we need help to address. So they talked to about 169 patients, and about 40% of them were worried about having enough money to pay for rent, mortgages, or utilities. And then, so about 40% of them are worried about paying for rent, mortgage, and utilities. And a quarter worried about having to pay for other bills in the last year, or worried about having to try to find safer, affordable housing. A third often worried about having enough healthy food in their home to feed everybody in their family. And 1 in 5 reported that they worried about safety or violence in their neighborhood. In addition, 23% had applied for and were denied for public benefits. And what's really interesting about this is, although we have clearly show a lot of patients who do have legal needs, some of them multiple legal needs, these are not always mutually exclusive, only 13% of these patients ever talk to their attorney at all about their potential legal needs. So the National Center for Medical Legal Partnership at George Washington University has shown that there's a lot of really strong benefits for MLPs. One is that it can improve your physical environment, particularly kind of helping with housing and things like that. It does show an increased access to health care, other basic necessities, as well as educational services. And it does decrease stresses on patients. So what are some of the unmet local or social needs that might impact how providers interact with their patients? You can show, it's been shown that women from poor neighborhoods are more likely to have adverse birth outcomes. Childhood obesity rates are increasing about 10% nationally. However, if you live in a lower income neighborhood, the rates are actually double that. Low income is also associated with higher prevalence of asthma and smoking. So legal intervention can probably help improve some of these health outcomes. Families who had legal intervention were able to gain access to more government resources, and actually their vaccination rates went up, and they had lower rates of hospitalization. The families described having improved self-reported health as well as well-being and decreased levels of stress. Another study showed a cohort of children with asthma in Ohio who were placed in housing without environmental triggers, which reduced their asthma exacerbations, so they were not going to the hospital as often. And again, another group of adults with asthma saw a 91% reduction in hospital admissions and ED rate visits after legal intervention helped them with their housing situations. Unfortunately, these are all really small studies, so there's still a lot to learn about how well an MLP can actually help with these things. But there's also been shown some positive financial implications for both providers and patients when having an MLP in a hospital setting. In New York City, the health partners for the MLP there found that they, for every $16 they invested into the MLP, for every dollar they invested in the MLP, they got a return of $16. And a rural MLP in Iowa actually found a return on investment of over 300%. That same MLP also showed that they were able to help over 700 patients with legal needs. Their actual medical debt was reduced by $4 million, and they gained $2 million worth of benefits over the course of 3 years. So we're going back to, we're just going to talk a little bit more about CLASI and how we implemented it here.
So the Delaware Medical Legal Partnership is a collaboration between Community Legal Aid Society, or CLASI for short, and Christiana Care Health System, and our goal is to improve health for patients and also their experience, as well as to reduce costs for Christiana Care. And it's funded by the Managing Fund at the bottom of the screen. So who is CLASI? CLASI is a private nonprofit law firm. We're dedicated to providing equal access will note there's no M in eye health for medical malpractice. We do not do medical malpractice. I'm the child of a physician who was told in very firm words if I have anything ever to do with medical malpractice, I will be disowned. And I have a very good relationship with my father, and that's my assurance to you that we are here to help you and your patients. We are not here to attack Christiana Care Health providers. So just a little bit more detail. What do we mean when we say income supports and insurance? We're talking about things like cash assistance, TANF, temporary assistance for needy families, which used to be called welfare, general assistance, refugee funds, child care subsidies or purchase of care, really essential to enable people to be able to work and sustain employment and housing. Food and nutrition programs, what used to be called food stamps is now called SNAP. Sometimes people are incorrectly denied eligibility for SNAP. They may have a penalty put on them. They may be calculated for the wrong amount, and it makes it hard to make sure they get the nutritional needs met. These are issues with the partnerships to look at. Issues with WIP, issues with Social Security. A patient who is clearly disabled and unable to work, has no income, and was denied SSI or SSDI. Those are cases we can look at and potentially assist with. Or an overpayment of Social Security where Social Security made a mistake and is now holding the patient's check. That's a big problem, and that's a problem we can help with. Medicaid and medical assistance. So if you have a patient where you prescribe something that's medically necessary and it's denied by Medicaid or the MCO, we can appeal that and hopefully overturn that decision. Also, issues with eligibility. We've seen a lot of problems recently for lawfully residing immigrants who are eligible for Medicaid in certain circumstances be wrongfully denied. There are some special programs such as Medicaid waivers that can be challenging sometimes to get patients approved for, and we can assist with those as well. Housing, so eviction, landlords legally locking tenants out, tenants being accused of lease violations. We see that a lot with patients with behavioral health needs that maybe have some behaviors that are part of their disability that the landlord is trying to evict them for. Those are issues we can try to help with. Unsafe conditions, bring back to our example. Patients living in places with mold or other problems like roaches that are impacting their health. That's something we can help with. Request for reasonable accommodations. You have a patient who has a heart condition or a respiratory condition where they can't walk very far, and they have a huge open parking lot to walk through to get to their large apartment building. Well, we can advocate to get them a dedicated spot by the door so they're not putting themselves at risk just to get home. Discrimination, issues with subsidized housing. Someone who was kicked off of the subsidized housing list where they shouldn't have been, or they're denied subsidized housing when they have good cause. So perhaps there was some issues with an eviction in the past, but it was due to domestic violence. We may be able to assist them with overcoming that. Utilities, so actual or threatened shutoffs can be really essential, especially if you have patients that are on medical equipment. If you have a patient on oxygen at home, you do not want their alarm to be shut off. So those are definitely situations where you can call us. And issues with homeownership, including discrimination, problems with code enforcement, foreclosure, predatory home repairs. Education and employment for your patients that are in primary and secondary education. We can assist with special education problems, and for higher education with, for example, accommodations. We have a patient maybe that struggles with anxiety or depression and needs to take school a little bit slower of a pace with some accommodations, or has arthritis and is unable to work at the same pace in an exam and needing extended time. These are all cases we can potentially assist with. Some
partnership has a typical process like most medical legal partnerships, and it's kind of a cyclical flow. So the first step is education. This is typically education of providers, and this could take place in any kind of form. It could be something like this. I know Marissa's done grand rounds. We have staff meetings, or just going to, or we also just schedule regular presentation times. So the education is structured in two different ways. One is about screening and identifying for legal problems, and the other part of the presentation or the education is talking about specific legal problems. For example, Medicaid eligibility, or housing discrimination, or unlawful eviction, and things like that. So they could be very topic specific. The next step is screening the patients. So you would screen the patients to make sure that they determine whether or not they actually have a addressable civil legal need. If an addressable civil legal need is identified, then they are referred to the attorneys or paralegals at the Delaware MLP to help address that issue. When they're referred, then the attorneys, the legal team will take action. Action could be anywhere from sitting with a client and trying to just give them some tips on how to handle a particular situation. It could include writing a letter for them on their behalf, or it could even include something as full representation, depending on how long it takes, on what the actual situation is. So the action actually does take, it could be a very brief interaction, which is only like for one appointment, or it could extend for several months. And then the final part is, which is part of the important part of why they're embedded in the health system, is feedback back to the providers. So the providers understand, know what happened, why it happened, and then they can go back to addressing the clinical need. All of this is done, of course, with consent of the patient. It's not done automatically. So to be eligible to be in the DMLP, Christiana Care, the patient must receive primary care from the Christiana Care Medical Group, had at least one hospitalization or 2 emergency department visits in the last 6 months, and have household or personal income below 200% of the, at or below 200% of the federal poverty level, which is approximately just a little over $4,000 a month for a family of 4. So the screening process can be done differently depending on where you're at the patient and where the legal need is identified. Outpatients may come to the clinic for a visit and mention some sort of need that triggers a response to the provider, like, oh wait, maybe we can help you with that. It's also the same thing for inpatients as well, where they can be triggered as well with a need while they're in the hospital. And in both these cases, what they can do is actually go. You can connect the provider can connect them with a health guide, and the health guide will do a formal screening process with them to determine if they're eligible for the program and if they actually have an addressable civil legal need. CareLink has also been doing some calls with our high-risk patients to kind of do pre-screening with them as well to determine whether or not they may have a legal need that we can address as well. There's also an emergency screening that if a client or a patient has a court appearance within 10 days, or it seems like an emergency legal problem, we can accelerate the screening process to help get an attorney to them as soon as possible. So once the patient is referred, the appointment is scheduled, there's consent forms are signed and scanned to the patient's electronic medical record. They will go have an appointment with the Delaware medical legal team here in the hospital. Well, actually, Wilmington typically is where the office is actually located. And then they will evaluate and provide appropriate legal services, as I described earlier. So they also have this other feature, which is kind of neat. It's a non-referral provider consult. And this is it's more like general information for a provider. So if you are a social worker or a doctor or a nurse, and you're starting to see some things come across your patients that they seem to have the same typical need, you could call the lawyers or the paralegals, and they'll kind of give you some general information. You might be able to help give these patients to get them into the right direction for their need. So it might be something that could help with a lot of numerous different patients at once, rather than a one-on-one type of situation. So we have social work, which is one phase of this process. But the medical legal partnership can help social work move things even further forward. So a social worker can help assist with patients with like filling out SNAP applications and things like that. Well, the MLP can step in if those applications are denied. Social worker can connect patients with homeless shelters. The MLP can actually take action against the landlord for to terminate a lease or about a wrongful eviction. A social worker can provide resources for domestic violence. Medical legal partnership can actually go to court for an emergency, for petitioning for a protective order. So it's just one more tool that providers have to help get patients moving, help with their social needs. The other thing that's a little bit different with the why having rather than just having a straight referral system, which is what the hospital had done previously, is that the lawyer is actually in the hospital setting. They're here, so it makes it easier for the patient to actually have access to them. They don't have to go to a separate office to talk to the attorney. They can all do it here in the hospital. And it also allows the attorney to be involved with clinical meetings as needed, which can also help the providers help their patients as well. So one of the things that is kind of important to keep in mind is because there's a lot of people are kind of can be afraid of legal problems, legal needs. One of the things we want to keep in mind is that, as Marissa said, we're not involved in malpractice suits whatsoever. In fact, the MLP will not take on any case that's adverse to the hospital. So that's just off the table right from the beginning. And the other thing that's kind of important to maintain, as a provider, we're not asking you to actually do legal analysis. We're not actually trying to solve a legal problem. This is more of just identify the legal problem. Help figure out, help get them to the right resources so that they can get what they need, the patient can get what they need. So the medical legal partnership started in February of this year, so they've been running for about 6 months. Since February, they've screened approximately 150 patients, and about 23% of them have actually been identified as having an eligible legal need, civil legal need, and referred to attorneys. The average age of the patients, both both screened and deemed to have an eligible legal need is 52 years old. Just kind of talk a little bit about what some of the unmet legal needs are of our the patients who have been referred. A little over a third has been about housing and utilities, and a little less than a third has been income supports and insurance. 23% are referred for personal and family status reasons. So, in conclusion, medical legal partnership is an interaction between the healthcare, legal aid, and population health. Social determinants of health, including legal issues, can harm patient health and outcomes. And resolving legal issues for patients can improve access and health outcomes for our patients. I would like to, or we would like to actually recognize the team that's put together this Delaware Medical Partnership. It's an extensive group of people from both Christiana Care and CLASI. And we'd be happy to take on any questions.
I have a bunch of questions.
Okay.
But I just start with one. So, who does the screening in general, and from which department do you get the most patients in general? Or is it from outpatient services or inpatient services?
So the question was, who does the screening in general, and what services are we seeing the most patients from? So the people who are doing the screening are the health guides, patient support services, CareLink, and then social work. So the physicians and other providers will connect them to those individuals, to those groups, to do the full screening. We are seeing mostly adults come through the system. I think I don't know the exact breakdown between CareLink versus other providers. We can certainly get that data for the next time we see this. But definitely are seeing a lot from CareLink and from social work, I would say. I'm looking at Caitlin as one of our boots on the ground for the project.
Yeah. Right now, the way the referral process process works since the health guides are doing a lot of the screening. We're seeing a lot through the health guides, but we're finding out by asking more questions, it is a lot of physicians and other providers connecting the patient with the health guides to do the actual more time-consuming screening process.
So for those of you that are remote, what Caitlin indicated was we are seeing a lot of referrals coming from physicians that we learned through the process, but the actual screening is done by the health guides or the social workers who are connected to the patient by the physician.
So I gather that you make a good point that you are in not a adversarial relationship with the health system, but surely there are patients or individuals who need advocacy with respect to getting care or getting the kind of care that they need. How do you handle that, or is that just not come up on your radar screen yet?
So the question was, starting with an acknowledgement that we won't take matters adverse to Christiana Care, but what would we do if a patient needs some access to services? I wouldn't see that as adverse if, as I'm contacting the provider and saying, I've been working with your patient and he disclosed to me this history of trauma and I really think he needs to get into therapy. Is that something you can help him coordinate? I would see that as actually being a collaboration rather than something that's adverse because, you know better than I do, you have a limited number of minutes with each patient in the clinic and sometimes something will come out to us that they haven't told you that is relevant to the health care that you're providing them. And so I see that as a collaboration.
Yeah, I do too. I just wanted to make sure that there was an aspect of advocating for the patient within the healthcare system as part of this as well.
Yeah, so the next statement was just wanting to make sure that there is advocacy within the healthcare system as well. And I would say that that's part of and another nice component of medical legal partnerships is that there is ideally a back and forth between the healthcare providers and the legal team, especially when the legal issue is connected to health. So you may refer us a patient for a legal issue, but we need to get some medical justification or documentation from you. And certainly we would get into contact with the providers and discuss the situation and see if, for example, we could obtain a letter to support a reasonable accommodation request. Or maybe you prescribed a service that was denied by Medicaid and we need to ask you to testify at a hearing to get that covered. So there is a back and forth relationship. And I absolutely have had situations where I've been able to send a provider information and records that they didn't have already about the patient because they hadn't disclosed it, that helps them to provide better care. Any other questions?
What's the age range of the patients you are serving right now? Small, elderly?
So the question was, what's the age range of the patients we're serving? There's no age requirement to the program, so we could serve anyone from 0 to 120 if they're so lucky.
Our oldest is 84.
Our oldest is 84.
Youngest is 18.
And our youngest is 18.
Those are the screened. The oldest actually found eligible was like 34. So it's the entire adult span. And it's actually it's actually pretty evenly spaced between the different age groups. The number of people we're actually talking about. Yeah.
Do you want the referral to come on the social worker here in the hospital from the social worker, or can the patient contact you, or always go through someone in the hospital?
That's a great question. So the question was, do you want the referral to always go through the social worker health guide, or can the patient contact you directly? So it does always have to go through the patient, the health guides, the patient support service, or social work, depending on where you are in the hospital system. If someone were to contact us directly, we would direct them them to patient support services, so it would just be unnecessarily bouncing the patient around. And that's because, well, for a couple different reasons. The biggest one being before you can, we have to have HIPAA compliant consent signed to have the back and forth communication that we need. We also need to be sure that someone is actually eligible for the program, and the medical team has access to their chart that we don't have, that we can verify all of that information. And for statistics purposes, of course, too. That's very important. Any other questions?
Hi, this is Omar here. I'm on the phone here. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, thanks. I'm not sure if anyone from primary care is there, but I just wanted to add our appreciation for the partnership that we've developed, especially at the Wilmington campus.
Thank you so much. And for those of you that are in the center-based practices, we have been recently putting out a new self-screen that's a half-page form that's in a lot of the waiting rooms now that the patients fill out, and then that information gets connected to the patient support services by the office staff, so that a patient can actually overview him or herself that there's an issue.
So it seems I was surprised by the few number of patients that are eligible compared to the number of patients you screen. What is the most important reason for not being eligible?
Yeah, so the question was about the difference between the number of patients screened and the number actually referred for legal services. And what we've found is the biggest factor is the requirement that there be one hospitalization or 2 emergency room visits in the 6-month period. So there are a lot of people that have needs that aren't meeting the high utilizer factor. So that's something that we as a team will discuss at our next meeting, and whether, that's something that should be relaxed, can be relaxed. But as of right now, that's the eligibility factor that is the biggest barrier. Yeah.
That actually was my question. A lot of times our patients have their landlords are in major violation, but not all of my patients have been here, and they don't. So that right there, I guess. So what would you tell a patient if you know that this program isn't going to be suitable for them, but they're living with termite infested, rodent infested, she's pregnant, they're clearly in violation.
Yeah.
So, what's the answer to that patient?
So the question was, what do you do with patients who aren't eligible? And I will say, just because I think you were in the Healthy Women, Healthy Babies program. So we do have another partnership with the Division of Public Health for Healthy Women, Healthy Babies participants, which is a separate process. I won't confuse all of you. We can connect afterwards, but there isn't that hospitalization requirement for that. So those women are in luck, and you can refer us to that. Your other patients, you have a couple options. There's a number called the Legal Health Link, which is a number that people can call to get connected to one of the legal service agencies in Delaware. Unfortunately, that means they're going to be subjected to the same limitations and priorities that the general population are, but that certainly is enforced. It's called the Delaware Legal Health Link, and it's run by Delaware Volunteer Legal Services through Wagner Law School. So that's the number you can have handy. You can also use the consult feature, so you can email that email address that we have, which is mlpintake@de-CLASI.org, and ask us, hypothetical situation, no patient names or anything like that. Where would you point this person in, or do you have maybe a brochure or something that I can give someone in this situation? And so that's kind of a backdoor way that you might be able to get some assistance indirectly for your patients. For those of you that are here in person, we have brochures over by the water bottles that one of them is called an advocacy code card, and it has an overview of how to refer your patients to us, and it also includes that email address to the MLP intake. So you can take one of those back with you if you get somewhere. Any other questions? We've been very positive.